Hi everyone, welcome to the webinar. My name is Ellen Cools. I'm the Associate Editor with Canadian Biomass Magazine, WPAC's media partner. Thanks for joining us today. As many of you know, Canada's wood pellet industry produces 3.5 million tons of pellets per year, but more than 90% is exported. In contrast, wood pellet consumption for building heat in Canada is small compared to total building heat demand. To determine the potential building heat market for wood pellets in Canada, WPAC asked TorchLight Bioresources to carry out a study on this topic. In today's webinar, we will find out the results of that study from TorchLight Bioresources founder and Managing Director Jamie Stephen and his colleague Jean Blair. Jamie and Jean will be sharing insights from the study for about 40 minutes. During the presentation, please feel free to write in your questions under the Questions tab in the right-hand corner of your screen. I will be monitoring the questions as they come in, and after Jamie and Jean are finished presenting, I will ask them your questions. Feel free to write any follow-up questions during that time too. Also, if you have any questions for WPAC, Gord will be available to answer those questions. Before we get started with the presentation, I believe Gord wanted to say a few words about the study and the feedback WPAC is looking for. So Gord, take it away.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon to some in Eastern Canada. Just want to mention that WPAC is very pleased to partner with Canadian Biomass Magazine on presenting this webcam for our membership. This is one of 4 domestic marketing initiatives that we're working on this year, including certification of EN Plus and CAN Plus for our members and providing an update to that program. We're working on an initiative to get the EN 303-5 standard for Austrian European boilers accepted in Canada, putting a lot of effort into that. So trying to get a greater number of boilers in the market to increase domestic consumption. We've worked on a social media campaign, which Lindsay will be presenting on tomorrow. And finally, there's this Canadian market study that we've done to try to really zero in on what the opportunities are here in Canada. I'm really looking forward to hearing what members think about this study and to see what your ideas are about where we ought to go next, to see if you think that we should have a working group. At this time, we're only making this information available to members, but we also believe that there would be significant benefit in sharing this information publicly. And should we repeat this webinar for the general public interested on member views on that. So I'm looking forward to a very interesting presentation from Jamie here, and would like to take your questions at the end and see where we go next. So I'll turn it over to Jamie now.
Thanks, Gordon. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Want to thank the Wood Pellet Association for the opportunity to do this study, and then obviously to present to you today. I would like to highlight that Jean Blair, who's also on the line, did much of the data collection, analysis, and the mapping and presenting the maps that you will see today. So really kudos to Jean and the analysis there, and she'll be able to answer any methodology questions, etc. At the end of the webinar. So introduction, maybe I'll just briefly mention TorchLight. So we're Ottawa-based consultancy. We about half our work is for the Government of Canada, almost exclusively on bioenergy. We've done a lot of work related to the Clean Fuel Standard, which is forthcoming, quite impactful policy, and also related to things like the role of bioenergy in net zero Canadian economy, and then at a kind of more micro scale, a lot of feasibility studies for heat plants, combined heat and power district energy systems, etc. So overview of the presentation, I'll give a brief introduction as to kind of the background and where this is coming from, and then the purpose and approach for the actual study. Market quantification is, really what we're looking at here is what does the heat market look like in Canada, and what role can wood pellets play? So we've broken it down by province and census division. So really getting into some of the smaller geographic areas to really identify where that opportunity is instead of kind of simply at a provincial level, and then type of fuel that we're going to be replacing, broken down by residential, commercial, institutional, and then also looking at farm energy use. Then what we did was we looked at a kind of the comparison between supply and demand, both on a national basis, but also at a local geographic basis, as to whether or not the existing wood pellet industry would be able to supply, for instance, using bulk delivery, nearby demand. The study also included some comparisons of cost and putting carbon related to that as well, because obviously at this point in time we are pricing carbon, and that does relate to the competitiveness of pellets. And then identifying, in conclusion, some of the key market opportunities. So I don't need to get into kind of the details in terms of, your industry, likely better than I do. But really, this is, because the industry is so export dependent, we really want to look at, growing this domestic demand. Really, we do see it as the wood pellet industry as a key contributor to decarbonization in Canada, and we are working with WPAC to help the government of Canada to also see that. But really, if you're looking at where some of the largest GHG reductions can come from and the cost competitiveness of those reductions within the marketplace, wood pellets have an extremely important role to play. It's worth noting that that in Canada, we actually are the highest per capita consumer of space and hot water heat in the world. If in Canada at a policy level, we make a lot of comparisons to the US, sometimes the UK, but our per capita space and hot water demand is double that of those jurisdictions. So that's a really important thing to consider. And as we know, in a typical residence, about 80% of the energy consumed by households is for space and hot water heat. There's obviously at a larger facility scale, the coal plant closures in Canada should be driving pellet consumption. Unfortunately, we haven't seen that to date. But also taking into consideration that Canada is not at all on track to meet Paris commitments. And so, again, there is an important role for wood pellets to play. So the purpose and approach for this study is really to quantify and assess potential building heat market for wood pellets in Canada. As I mentioned, we're defined by geography, and so census division, and if you're in Ontario or Atlantic Canada, that would kind of be by county. They're pretty consistent between census division and county level. Then defined by sector and by building type. So really what we wanted to determine what was a realistic market size. We can say, okay, well, wood pellets can do all building heat, but really looking at what is a realistic market size given the price of alternatives. So what we assumed in terms of this filter, if you will, as to what is a realistic market. So no natural gas availability in that area. We essentially filtered out any place where natural gas was available would not be a potential market for wood pellets. Also, utilizing kind of the EU experience, outside of population centers with 5,000 people or more, we considered that any place that has 5,000 people or more, that was kind of considered outside the realistic market, addressable market. So I know that some people will kind of contest that. The justification for that is when you get to a larger size, in the EU in particular, we see a lot more district energy installations. It's absolutely true that if there is no district energy system in a town of say 6,000-7,000 people, that presents a pretty good market opportunity for wood pellets. We felt it was an appropriate filter given that even not every building in rural Canada is going to be within market, and so you're going to have a bit of give and take there in terms of what is the realistic market, but we thought that it was an appropriate filter. Also, we essentially, if you look at where policy is in some of the jurisdictions and some of the provinces that have extremely low carbon electricity, namely British Columbia, Manitoba, and Quebec, because of their significant and in actual fact oversupply of hydroelectricity, we didn't see a potential in terms of switching from electric heat in those jurisdictions to wood pellets. That's not to say, and so what was considered in scope though was if buildings in those jurisdictions are currently using propane or heating oil, those were considered in scope. And then also switching from electric heat to wood pellets in jurisdictions that have a higher carbon intensity electricity or have a higher cost of electricity. Basically, the way that we modeled things was the decision to switch to pellets would be space heat led, but that if a building was already heated with space heat or was already heated with wood pellets, that hot water demand would be included. Basically though, that we assumed that if a building, if the only opportunity in that building was for hot water, i.e. domestic hot water, that wouldn't provide an opportunity for wood pellets. And then we provided a contrast to cost and carbon performance relative to competitors, including heat pumps, etc. And then, as I mentioned, looked at the balance between supply and bulk delivery on a regional basis. So into the results. So this is a graph of the total pellet heat market. What we found was that wood pellets, the addressable market for wood pellets is about 18% of the building heat market in Canada. That doesn't seem like much, but to put numbers in perspective, heating buildings in Canada, the amount of energy to heat buildings in Canada is equal to the entire energy consumption in Poland, or in Egypt, obviously a warmer country, but 100 million people. So it is a very substantial energy demand. And so 18% of it is quite significant. About 218 petajoules, which works out to kind of close to 12 million tons per year of pellets. This is the addressable market. As you can see, Ontario is the largest opportunity, but you do also see significant demand in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and then surprisingly also Alberta, where there's actually quite a few commercial institutional buildings that don't have natural gas access. So this is a map of the total pellet market in terms of by census division. So again, this is a map completed by Jean Blair. As you can see, there's some real hot spots across the country. For instance, like the Bruce Peninsula in Ontario. You obviously see sections of Atlantic Canada quite red, near Sydney, Nova Scotia, by St. John's. And then again around actually Edmonton and Calgary, and really what you're seeing here is areas that are not not within the dense core, but there's some large acreages, other areas that are quite large users of propane. This shows the market potential by current fuel. What we did include cordwood as a potential market opportunity. This isn't just about decarbonization, but it's also about the potential market. And certainly, cost competitive wood pellets relative to cordwood, particularly if you're looking for that automation and that whole building heating option without having to load cordwood. There is a significant market opportunity there. Incidentally, if you're really focusing on the decarbonization aspect, really what you see is the largest potential by far is in Atlantic Canada, and that's a lot in terms of replacing fuel oil, but it's also replacing quite high carbon electricity. And in actual fact, if you're heating with electricity, for instance, in Nova Scotia, that's more than double the carbon intensity of heating with heating oil. And even switching to a heat pump in Nova Scotia under the current carbon intensity of the electricity grid, which incidentally will be changing over time, but that's essentially equal to natural gas, even with the high efficiency heat pump. So you're not seeing decarbonization unless you're switching to wood, essentially. And this shows that electricity GHG intensity. As we can see, living in Ottawa, where there's kind of a one-size-fits-all kind of mentality in many ways, in many policies, and that's simply not the case. As you can see, there's a huge range in terms of the GHG intensity of electricity, which has significant implications for how each province would decarbonize. Because basically, when we're talking about decarbonization, we have kind of two primary energy sources. We've got electricity, or we've got essentially wood. And so what that means is that, yes, installing heat pumps, electric vehicles in BC, Manitoba, Quebec, and Ontario will have significant decarbonization efforts or impacts, but that's not the case in many other provinces. When we look at breaking it down now into the residential market by current fuel, what you can see is that, and incidentally, residential market is about 2/3 of the market. Commercial institutional is about 1/3. So what you can see is that, again, Ontario is the largest opportunity. But when you're looking at replacing the largest, the most carbon intense energy forms, it's really Atlantic Canada. And then essentially replacing electric heat in Alberta and Saskatchewan. And that's really where you're going to see the decarbonization occur. Looking at residential market by building type, again, obviously, single family detached is by far the majority of the market. You're looking at kind of 90% of the market. And this makes sense in terms of, a lot of the time we're talking about rural properties, properties in smaller population centers where you're not going to see as many apartment buildings or for instance, duplexes, etc. This is the residential market presented geographically. Again, single-family detached homes dominate that, but you do see those similar hotspots to the overall market, which makes sense given that residential is about 2/3 of the opportunity. Bruce Peninsula, some opportunities in some significant opportunities in Central Ontario, and then parts of Atlantic Canada, obviously. When we break it down then by number of potential units, and this is a good indication of the number of, for instance, wood pellet boilers that would be required to fully address the market. What you're seeing here for instance, in Ontario, you'd need 450,000 boilers to really address the market. In some cases, obviously, the apartment is done on an individual apartment basis, so it's not going to be totally 450,000, but at least 400,000 boiler units to meet that full demand. And so for the boiler manufacturers out there, obviously a significant opportunity. There's about 850,000 solid wood boilers installed in the EU currently. We're obviously not going to meet every single market demand as presented here, but significant opportunity for the manufacturers, with a lot of them in Austria for sure. This is a breakdown of the single-family detached home market. Again, pretty consistent, and it shows the number of detached homes and essentially the number of boilers that could be sold by census division, by county, to meet that demand. Moving on to the commercial institutional market. So typically you're seeing obviously larger projects here. This is typically in the range of 50, 75 kilowatts up to kind of 5,000 kilowatts or 5 megawatts. What you're seeing here is by far the largest opportunity in terms of decarbonization, again, is in Atlantic Canada. Essentially, much greater than all the other regions of the country put together in terms of displacing high carbon fuels. There is, if you include though in terms of high carbon fuels, propane, Alberta, Ontario, significant opportunities, and then quite a few commercial buildings in Quebec, and obviously with train and propane supply issues. I always find it a little crazy that if Quebec's having a hard time getting propane, yet the buildings are in the middle of a forest. And so something, we certainly an opportunity from an energy security standpoint, not only just a decarbonization standpoint of addressing that market. This is the total commercial institutional market in presented geographically. Again, central Alberta, and that was one of the big surprises that we found through the study, is the amount of propane that is consumed by the commercial institutional market in central Alberta. Again, Bruce Peninsula, and then parts of the Maritimes and Newfoundland as well. The farm energy consumption. So farm buildings were kind of presented a little bit differently. So this is essentially all farm energy consumption. So we don't know, it's not detailed as exactly what it is being used for, but one of the key things that we found here is that there's a very significant amount of fuel oil consumed in Saskatchewan for on-farm. And so that does present some opportunities. Obviously, those will be typically longer distance from where the pellet manufacturing occurs than others. But in terms of decarbonization, there is some opportunity there. And then obviously, and this goes back to the discussion again in terms of propane supplies in Quebec, that's essentially the second largest farm market, and it's displacing propane and some small amounts of fuel oil in Quebec. This is a map of essentially the number of farms. We don't have the farm numbers are not broken down by energy consumption by census division. So this is an indicator of where the farms are. But certainly some additional data would be extremely useful to be able to understand that farm market a bit better. So kind of moving on now to where, the demand supply balance. What we see obviously is in British Columbia is by far the largest capacity and also producer in Canada. And then, there's Ontario's second, but as we know about, I think it's about 400,000 tons of that is in Wawa, which is currently not operational to my understanding. And so, what you're seeing then is actually Quebec's the second largest producer, followed by Alberta. So then we look. Basically, what Jean did is conduct a what's called a network analysis, and this is utilizing the road networks. What we did was we put a 250-kilometer limit from each of the pellet plants identified in the Wood Pellet map. This isn't as the crow flies. It's actually utilizing the distances on the road network. So 250 kilometers one way. Obviously a pretty long haul, but still something that's already actually been conducted in Ontario. So actually longer haul distances than that, which is obviously quite substantial. And what we did was basically say, the way that the network analysis works is each location on the map, that location is supplied by the nearest pellet plant as dictated by the road network. And so what it shows is, and then utilizing that as an overlay, we're able to determine how much of the pellet market can be addressed utilizing bulk delivery from the existing pellet mills. A key consideration here is obviously the electricity price by city. This kind of shows, how electricity prices across the country are applicable, and to the competitiveness of wood pellets. I'm just going to bounce back to the previous slide. I forgot to mention something, is that basically what we found, and as within the report, there's a long list. I decided not to include the full list here, but basically the summary is that in British Columbia, what you see is there's dramatically more supply than could ever be required by the demand. And so in British Columbia, exports will continue to be required. What you see in then Atlantic Canada is most of the rest of the country. There's parts of Quebec which are a little bit more like British Columbia, where supply outstrips demand significantly. What you see in most of the rest of the country is that potential demand is dramatically higher than wood pellet capacity. So what we have is a bit of a misalignment between on the heating side anyways. Obviously it makes sense from an export perspective and a wood fiber supply perspective, but from a domestic space and hot water heat demand perspective, there's essentially a misalignment between supply and demand. And so you're seeing, for instance, in Atlantic Canada, essentially relative to the potential demand, supply is only around 20%, for example, of that potential demand. Going back to that electricity price side, so what we did then was we looked at the competitiveness of wood pellets to alternatives. And so again, there's a huge range in terms of the carbon intensity of electricity across the country, but there's also quite a big range in terms of pricing. And in general, what you see is in those provinces of BC, Manitoba, and Quebec, you see those are actually also the lowest price because many of those hydroelectric dams are grandfathered and were paid off long ago. And so this sort of gives an indication of obviously, and then you obviously have to layer carbon pricing on top of this. But what this does is give an indication of the cost competitiveness of both electric resistance heating, but also heat pumps. This is just a refresher as to the carbon intensity of that useful heat, and showing that what you have is a big difference. We looked at the carbon intensity, and this shows the carbon intensity of that useful heat. So, people don't want wood pellets. They don't want electricity necessarily. They want the product that is actually being produced. And so in this case, it's useful space heat. And what you can see is that when you're looking at the carbon intensity of electric resistance heating in Ontario, it's about the same or maybe even a little lower than wood pellets on a life cycle basis. But when you compare it to Nova Scotia, switching to wood pellets results in a dramatic decarbonization. I'd also note that if you look at the utilizing the heat pump, which is typically has what's called a coefficient of performance. So this is how much energy in terms of electricity do you put in relative to the heat output. And in Nova Scotia, usually utilizing the current carbon intensity of the grid, and this would also be true in Saskatchewan and in Alberta, is that it's really no benefit relative to utilizing natural gas directly. So that means that really the only way for them to decarbonize space heating in those high carbon electricity jurisdictions, obviously people could have solar panels and run their own heat pump using that type of approach. But in terms of actual practicality, it's really switching to wood space heating. I'd also note that if you look at, it says heat pump ON average versus heat pump ON marginal. So if you add, excuse me for 1 second. If you add electrical demand to the grid, in many provinces, in a hydroelectric province, that can be met with additional hydroelectric generation. But in Ontario, the vast majority of additional demand will be met by natural gas-fired generation. So what that means is if you're adding a lot of heat pumps or electric vehicles, et cetera, to the grid, you can't use the average carbon intensity, which is largely met with nuclear power and then large hydro. That demand that supply is already allocated to the existing demand. If you're going to add electrical demand to the grid, you have to use the marginal factor, which is essentially the carbon intensity of any new electricity that has to be supplied. In Ontario, about 80 to 90% of that is likely to be natural gas fired, which has quite a high carbon intensity, which shows then that even in Ontario, switching to wood pellets is dramatically lower carbon than switching to a heat pump. So when we talk about our policy arguments, things like that for wood pellet heating in Canada, the usual default is, oh, well, we're just going to do heat pumps. If you're adding electrical demand to the grid, you have to use marginal, not average. So looking at the cost comparison, and I would note that we did, for conservative sake, utilize this is for Ontario, but we did use the average just to be quite conservative in terms of the carbon intensity. But what you can see is that in all cases in Ontario, and I would say all of Western Canada, if there is natural gas, wood pellets are not going to be competitive. I mean, even with very high, we've done estimates in carbon pricing, and it'll show on the next slide, but it's extremely obviously difficult to compete with natural gas. Slightly different thing in Atlantic Canada, where most of the natural gas penetration is very low, and it all comes out of the Boston market anyways. And you're looking at kind of $20 to $22 a gigajoule delivered for natural gas in those jurisdictions. Different thing in Ontario and Western Canada. What we can see though is that wood pellets, whether they're in a stove or a boiler, are absolutely cost competitive and actually lower cost than fuel oil, propane, or electric resistance heating. What we can also see though is that the capital cost is higher. However, it is not as high as geothermal heat pumps, and so that's an important distinction in general in Ontario. A geothermal heat pump and wood pellet boiler over kind of 20-25 years is going to be pretty comparable in terms of cost, as long as we don't see dramatic increases in electricity price, which is obviously unpredictable. But what we can see is that wood pellets, even with a boiler, which is obviously much higher cost than a stove, have a competitive advantage relative to heat pumps in terms of upfront capital costs, but obviously higher operating costs as you continue. Carbon pricing will obviously add to the competitiveness of wood pellets, as it makes fuel oil and propane more cost or higher cost. And the clean fuel standard, which you would have seen that WPAC has been doing some kind of policy advocacy and lobbying in that regard to ensure that we have and use fuel switching in the space heat sector. That should provide significant opportunities as well. So then, I'm almost wrapping up here, but this is essentially the impact of carbon pricing on heat costs. As the carbon price increases, obviously and this is for full pricing of carbon. What you see is that locations, places where electricity is extremely high cost, what you're seeing is that in that blue line heading up into the stratosphere is electric resistance heating in Nova Scotia, as if they fully priced in carbon, heading into kind of levels that are obviously lead to extreme energy poverty. You see the wood pellets in green there. A couple takeaways here is that under all carbon pricing scenarios, even up to $220 a ton, and this is for Ontario natural gas, what you're seeing is that wood pellets are not competitive with natural gas in Ontario. It's even with those very high pricing. But what you can see is that in all other scenarios, wood pellets, because you're not seeing a dramatic increase in the delivered cost of pellets, and that the emissions are zero rated from the boiler, you're seeing that over time, and as carbon price increases, obviously wood pellets become more competitive. So key market findings, and this is my last slide. Number one, we would say Atlantic Canada is the largest market opportunity at present. Highly dependent upon heating oil, and also note almost all that heating oil is either imported as finished fuel or comes from imported oil that is refined, for instance, in Irving, at the Irving refinery in St. John. So a huge opportunity to not only reduce carbon, but also to create greater rural and local economy competitiveness, and keep those expenditures on energy within the community. There's also limited natural gas availability. Typically, I think in Nova Scotia, it's about 2% of the residential energy consumption is natural gas. In New Brunswick, I believe it's about 1%. And even if you are connected to natural gas, the price is about 2.5 to 2.75 times that of Ontario, which in itself is obviously higher cost than even, for instance, Alberta. There's also high carbon electricity in most of those provinces. Muskrat Falls will modify that somewhat, but even with the maritime connection, etc., into Nova Scotia, there's the carbon intensity of the electricity is still going to be dramatically higher than you're going to find in Quebec, Manitoba, BC, or even Ontario for that matter. On the Ontario market, focus should obviously be on propane and heating oil displacement. There is that argument to be made about the marginal greenhouse gas intensity of that electricity, and that's something that we really do need to emphasize. But number one target should be that propane and heating oil. There are some challenges, obviously, in terms of the average low carbon electricity intensity, and the fact that Ontario is geographically very large and demand is quite spread out. Quebec, Alberta, and Saskatchewan offer a lot of non-residential market opportunities. So, for instance, farms in Saskatchewan and Quebec, and then commercial institutional in Alberta. Looking at the cost comparison, heat pumps will be the primary competitor to wood pellets. And what I would say is, in doing a lot of work for the government of Canada, and I wouldn't say lobbying, but advocacy for bioenergy is having a key role in decarbonization, is that there's an assumption that heat pumps are going to save the day, and that's what everybody's going to use, and why would we use anything else? So it's important to communicate to local politicians, to provincial politicians, and then nationally, that there is a critical role for wood pellets in decarbonization of space heat. And I would also add that when we look at the other sectors of the economy that need to be, or that are potential targets for decarbonization, there's essentially large trade exposed industries, and then transportation, both of which are going to be harder to decarbonize than space heating. Wood pellet production is not geographically correlated with the current potential demand, right? So we're seeing the biggest opportunities in terms of space heat demand in Atlantic Canada, in parts of Quebec and Ontario, but obviously the vast majority of production occurring in British Columbia, which already has pretty low carbon electricity, and then very limited heating oil and propane consumption. So that's something that the wood pellet industry will, if it is targeting the space heat demand, we might have to look at is it adding capacity in Atlantic Canada? Is it exports from British Columbia to Atlantic Canada and central Canada? How that can be dealt with. So with that, happy to answer any questions. As I mentioned, kudos really go out to Jean on her analysis here, and she can absolutely help address some of the questions as well related to methodology. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jamie, for those insights. We've got a few questions here, and if anyone listening has questions, please, again, feel free to write those into the question section on your right-hand side. I guess let's start off. You mentioned there's an imbalance between supply and demand for pellets across Canada. So are there any ideas that you have for how that undersupply can be addressed in the rest of the country as opposed to the oversupply in BC?
Yeah, so I think number one, obviously you could add capacity into Atlantic Canada. This is assuming that we've already, like, fundamentally current demand is dramatically lower for spacing heat and hot water than the current capacity in Atlantic Canada. So it's going to be hard to justify additional capacity for domestic markets until we build up those domestic markets. And WPAC is certainly making an effort through trying to accept European boilers and the Clean Fuel Standard, etc., to drive that forward. There is absolutely significant amounts of wood fiber available in Atlantic Canada. There's for Newfoundland, there's only one pulp mill left. Northern Pulp obviously shut down at the end of January, and that's about 1.3 million cubic meters coming onto the market of low-grade wood fiber and pulpwood. In northeast New Brunswick, you see since 2000 there have been 5 pulp mill shutdowns. Combined fiber consumption was about 4.5 million cubic meters. So there is wood fiber there. It's some of it's going to be pulpwood, and so there's a potential to add capacity. But then also, as I mentioned, we didn't look into it, and obviously the pellet producers have a lot of their supply allocated already. But looking at some of potential exports from British Columbia to other jurisdictions is something that could be looked at as to whether that would be viable or not.
Right. Okay. Yeah, we've got a comment here from John Arsenault. He's saying Atlantic production is being exported at close to 50% of production, and the local market needs to go up before adding capacity.
Yeah, and I would absolutely agree with that. And that's what we're working to do. This is obviously long-term projections, but if what I would say in general is that Canada has made some extremely ambitious climate commitments, and if it wants to meet any of these commitments by 2030, there needs to be a dramatic ramp up of or build out of pellet consumption capacity to contribute to those goals.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So in terms of the non-residential market opportunities in Saskatchewan and Quebec that you mentioned, what suggestions do you have for the industry to kind of get into that more?
So in terms of Saskatchewan, that's largely farms. We didn't delve into exactly what it's being used for, but I would assume there's a significant amount of grain drying, for example. I think that's definitely a market that could be approached. Obviously, I'm actually originally from Saskatchewan, and it's quite a distance to get into kind of southern parts of Saskatchewan in terms of the logistics. But if we're looking to decarbonize, that could be one potential option. I'd say Quebec, and particularly if you're talking about whether it's farms or hospitals, etc. Particularly any government buildings, I would say that Quebec could replicate what's already been done in Prince Edward Island, in parts of New Brunswick, and then currently now Nova Scotia in terms of procurement through government and through heat contracts, etc. So encouraging the government of Quebec, whether it's schools, hospitals, etc., to utilize their ability to procure and to do heat contracts. No upfront capital required from the provincial government in order to do that. What I would say is that recommending from a wood pellet perspective is that those procurements be open in terms of the type of wood form that's supplied, whether it's chips or pellets, etc. That would be a key component, and obviously wood pellets would have to compete with chips, but something that could absolutely be addressed. And then fundamentally, I think when we're looking at the residential scale, there's going to be opportunities hopefully afforded by the Clean Fuel Standard, which would bring capital into the sector to create compliance credits.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. So I got another question here about Ontario fact that the wood pellets aren't very competitive with natural gas, even with high pricing in the future. Can you go into a bit more about why that is?
It's simply, what our assumptions are in terms of the market pricing for wood pellets, and the fact that, in Ontario, for example, the delivered cost, and that includes transmission, distribution, and the commodity itself, is currently about $8 a gigajoule. It's hard to compete with that. We think that there's, when you get to the larger scale, and you're talking about, for instance, chips, which is kind of what you see in Copenhagen, Stockholm, etc., for very large combined heat and power plants, that's a kind of different situation. Wood pellets competing with natural gas. I wouldn't target Ontario natural gas initially as the primary place to go for wood pellets. There's greater opportunities that have not been explored in terms of competitiveness in Atlantic Canada, in displacing heating oil and propane in parts of Ontario that don't have natural gas. For instance, the North Shore of Lake Superior has no natural gas. And so that's really, it's kind of in many ways beside the point, because we haven't even...
Jamie, in your report, you showed the huge areas of the Bruce Peninsula, and all of northern Ontario is not covered by gas. So
exactly. Yeah, so there's huge areas that many properties. So there's natural gas lines running to most of those communities. Central Ontario, through kind of Haliburton, Hastings County in the northern part, there's no natural gas in there, and that's actually the highest concentration of people in Ontario that have no natural gas. Like Bancroft, into Fenelon Falls, etc. Bob Cajun, if you're obviously a fan of the hip, you've probably heard of Bob Cajun. But all those places have no natural gas, and so that's really where there's an initial opportunity. And if once that's addressed, then we can start having the natural gas conversation.
Right. Okay. So we've got a question here asking, is there a way to distinguish between wood pellet and wood chip in the analysis?
This is exclusively wood pellets, right? So what you see in Europe is really for those larger centers. There is some wood pellet consumption in district energy systems, absolutely. But if you're in close proximity to a forest, typically wood chips are going to be quite a lot lower cost than wood pellets, right? There's just obviously less processing. There's not really, you can air dry down to say 30-35% moisture content, and that's acceptable for the boilers. So it's just extremely hard to compete in those larger areas whereby a district energy system might be installed. Having said that, we don't have a lot of district energy systems in Canada, and building those out is going to take time. So there was, this analysis, the 18-19% of building heat demand is in areas that's excluding any place where you might have a district energy system. So without that build out, the potential market is even larger, obviously, right? But this is really trying to narrow it down to, if you had a idealized role for wood pellets in a low carbon economy, this is the role that it would take. And obviously that demand is dramatically higher than our current production capacity anyways.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, so we've got a comment here saying, in Quebec, we are asking the government to mandate that all new heating appliances be renewable energy only, which should favor electricity and biomass. It seems it will be official in the next climate change program. Other jurisdictions should follow.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think that we haven't thus far put in the policies to back up our climate commitments, and all these climate emergency declarations and net zero declarations. I don't think people have fully come to terms with what is actually required to get there. We have to, the new building requirements are typically easier to do from a policy perspective. But really, if we want to actually reduce emissions, we need to start talking about the existing buildings and how to decarbonize those. There's obviously some models from Europe whereby there's significant grants provided for the actual boilers, because really, when it comes to wood pellets, the challenge, particularly our boilers, is the upfront capital cost. And so there's the potential for grants, but we actually see the clean fuel standard as the greatest opportunity to bring capital into the market to dramatically reduce the upfront capital costs for building owners to get those boilers installed.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we've got another question here asking, has any similar analysis been done on the potential use of natural gas in Canada?
On the potential for natural gas?
Yeah, potential use of natural gas.
Like expanding natural gas
I believe
distribution?
So, yeah.
So I mean, obviously the Enbridges of the world are looking at increasing, they're saying we're part of the solution. We've done a lot of work on renewable natural gas as a decarbonization option. We're currently doing quite a large project for NRCan. We've done work for the CGA on renewable natural gas. A couple of things. One is the typical carbon intensity for renewable natural gas is higher than wood pellets. It's not zero. Particularly if you're doing things like the Germans do a lot of corn silage. So this is like, instead of growing corn for ethanol, you're growing it for biogas and then upgrading it to biomethane / renewable natural gas. Most analyses that have already, that have been conducted, or I guess all analyses that have been conducted thus far on renewable natural gas potential in Canada, what we're seeing is that renewable natural gas could meet maybe 3, maybe 4% of current natural gas consumption. So you've got Enbridge, FortisBC, all these utilities arguing that they're the solution for and utilizing RNG, and they simply will never have the volumes. But obviously they have a lot of lobbying power, and it's because it's the existing infrastructure. It's an easy win for the politicians, if you will. What I would say, though, as well, is that if you're looking at the pricing of renewable natural gas, is FortisBC is trying to procure it up to $30 a gigajoule, and they're having a hard time doing that. Part of that is that renewable natural gas can also be used as a transportation fuel. And so that RNG is going into the U.S. market, largely California, for decarbonization and transportation. And so we've done these kind of macro decarbonization studies, and in those studies, really you have to allocate RNG to transportation to decarbonize, which means that it shouldn't be used for something like heat, whereby wood pellets are more efficient and fundamentally lower cost fuel for that application.
Okay, it's very interesting. We got another question here. Actually a comment. In Austria, a similar program has had a positive effect on new installations, but also on replacements, as the old users follow the example set for new installations.
Yeah, I mean, so I think maybe I can just say that once you start getting a critical mass going, that can really accelerate things. It's hard to get that critical mass. We're seeing it a little bit in terms of on the chip side with provincial government procurement and PEI. But fundamentally, I would say there's no place where we've reached that kind of getting enough early adopters to then bring in the kind of mass market adoption of wood pellets. And so that's something that maybe Gord can address in terms of follow-up to the study, is really thinking about regions where, we've identified where there's some, great opportunity regions, is actually trying to concentrate some of our efforts in, 1 or 2 or 3 of those regions to create that critical mass and accelerate adoption.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would be really interesting to look into.
So Maybe there's about 5 minutes left.
Mhm.
And I think we should take some comment, or maybe just make a bit of analysis about where we should go from here. And from the perspective of the Wood Pellet Association, we think that Jamie and Jean have done a spectacular job here in really quantifying where the opportunities lie in Canada. And so it focuses us on where to look and what and how to compete. But obviously, this highlights opportunities, but now we need a plan on how to capitalize on these opportunities. And so we would look to doing that as a next step and include Jamie and Jean in that planning process. And as an association, we can't possibly make a marketing plan for the entire country, but we could focus on a particular region. Individual companies could use this report and put together their own marketing plans. But as an association, I guess we've got to figure out what is it that's driving the decision making. How broadly should we distribute this report? I know there was some hesitation when we discussed this at the board meeting about releasing this report publicly because it could potentially raise expectations that we might not be able to meet. Like if you look at the volumes of the volume potential that Jamie and Jean are suggesting here, it's about 7 times our current annual or 7 times our current annual production. So it's just absolutely vast, the opportunity that's here. So really, I guess we're looking for some opinions excuse me, from members as to where we would go next. I mean, we'll put a plan together, but we would definitely like to take some input. How would members like to be involved with this? And what's the sentiments about releasing this information publicly? And I have a kind of a personal feeling. I mean, I'll be guided by the wishes of the membership, but personally, I feel that the more widely this information is distributed, the more beneficial it'll be for us. If we could get the government regulators to understand the opportunities and shape policy to support us, the more market participants that we can get to understand it, they'll understand the relative costs of wood pellets and start to look at it more seriously, where there just seems to be a default now that people look to electricity or fossil fuels and kind of discount wood pellets without thinking about it seriously. So there's lots more work to do, but I think this report that Jamie and Jean have prepared is it just gives us a really solid base from which to figure out next steps.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we're just about out of time, but for anyone who wants to provide that feedback, Jamie and Jean's emails are on the screen, and you can email me or Gord. Our emails were in the registration emails that have been sent out. So thanks everyone for listening, and remember our second webinar in the series is happening tomorrow at 9 a.m. Pacific, 12 p.m. Eastern, and that one will be focused on the results of the National Social Media Campaign.